There's a really important story coming out of a report from the Inspectorate of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Services, and those entities are in one organisation, and also the Crime Prosecution Service Inspectorate. And they, working together, have found that the criminal justice system's response to rape allegations, well, it just isn't working. They say it often lacks focus, clarity and commitment. They say there's a blame culture between police and prosecutors. And they also identify finger-pointing and a deep division between agencies. What is the problem that they're trying to identify and diagnose? It is dismal conviction rates, very, very low rates of conviction around rape. When accusations are made, many times there isn't a prosecution, many times those prosecutions, when they occur, fail. Joseph Cottrey-Monson is a director at Mary Monson Solicitors who has acted in over 200 rape and sexual abuse cases. Joseph, thank you for your time this morning. This report then finding that the response of the criminal justice system to these rape allegations lacks focus, clarity and commitment, and also this blame culture between police and prosecutors, between the CPS and the police. What's meant by that? And is that also your understanding of what the situation is?
Well, the short answer is no, and I think it's slightly ironic that the phrase blame culture is used, because it looks as if the police and CPS are being blamed. And as a defence lawyer, you might expect me to join in, but big surprise, I'm afraid, on this occasion. I actually think this is not the police and the CPS's fault. I think this is a funding issue. Of course, anything that brings about just outcomes in rape cases is of course to be encouraged, but this government must be honest with itself, because, Darren, I say this reluctantly, it is blindingly obvious to those at the cold face of these cases that this is an issue about funding of fair, detailed, robust investigations, not a let's communicate more effectively between the CPS and the police issue. This is a problem that goes back a decade, predictably, to the austerity cuts. Remember, if you'll go with me on this, Darren, how we were told that the police would face 20% cuts by Theresa May those years ago, after we bailed out the banks, but it wouldn't affect frontline services. You remember that promise we were given? Well, you know what? We weren't told the truth. And over those 10 years, rape cases in particular became more difficult to investigate as the main evidence about relationships between adults, of course, has gone digital. And that digital evidence, messages between complainant and suspect, isn't that the evidence that can often prove or disprove whether a person was consenting to sex or not? You know,
I think what we're trying to do then is to get a picture as to why, with rape cases particularly, the conviction rate is so low, much lower than for other crimes, isn't it? And I think you've partly answered why you think that is, but what else might explain that?
Well, I think there will always be a challenge, and this isn't a race to the bottom or an acceptance that conviction rates must always be low. But one reason is that rape is a crime that has no independent witnesses, because sex is generally a private affair. It will always be a challenge in rape cases to get high conviction rates for that reason. Now, that doesn't mean that a cut of half of the rate in the space of a year and a half is acceptable. This actually goes back to a decision that was made between the CPS and the police, a policy decision to reduce the number of cases that were being brought. And it came about as a result of the fallout in 2019 of that quite shocking scandal involving an innocent young man accused of rape that you may remember, a young Liam Allen, I think he was a student. He was nearly convicted because police didn't check mobile phone records between him and the complainant until the trial. And there was a huge media fallout. A CPS report was commissioned by the then DPP, Alison Saunders, And a scaling back of prosecutions then followed, which we are now seeing the results of, because when they looked at the deficiencies in these cases, the police and the CPS realized that unless they had new resources for looking at digital evidence, the risk of miscarriages of justice and new scandals was simply too high to proceed. And that's what we are seeing in these dropped numbers now. Not they need to talk to each other anymore. It's an almost impossible task with the tools at their disposal currently.
Dating and the meeting of other human beings for these purposes, much of that will take place in the digital realm, at least initially, so that is where much of the evidence will exist. What specifically is needed to access and pass that evidence effectively in the way that you plainly think it's not being at the moment?
Well, the police are already under a duty under the PACE codes of practice to gather evidence which could assist the defence as well as the prosecution. And that evidence, of course, includes relevant evidence of how people may have been feeling or how people might have been discussing things that were going on at the time especially before a criminal complaint was made. That, of course, takes resources because it doesn't just need to be gathered, it needs to be gone through. And at the moment, we have a very unsatisfying disclosure process, an unsatisfying investigation oversight process, because the police who are bringing these cases and investigating them, and essentially they are the investigators for the prosecution side, are also the ones policing, or they're the ones who are monitoring what needs to go to the defence as well. And of course, there is an element sometimes. I say this with a degree of irony of the fox in the chicken coop when you're talking about your opponent in a criminal case who is responsible for gathering the material. But we must, it's not the best solution. It's the one we've got. The police should at least be able, with enough resources to go through this stuff, be given enough hours, enough officers, and we're talking about the cumulative effect of 20% year-on-year cuts. And what that's done to this work is it's created a kind of impossible and immovable apathy that really is, and it's an institutional, not a personal apathy in the police and the CPS as to how to investigate these cases. I have to say, it's an unenviable task, and the criticism they get, again, I'm a defence lawyer fighting tooth and nail with the police and the prosecution, so I accept that there's a, some of my colleagues may smirk slightly to see the irony of this. But the reality is that they're doing an impossible task, and they need to be properly funded.
The principle, of course, in this country, as it must be, is that someone is innocent until proven guilty. And someone might, with that principle in mind, look at these very low conviction rates and conclude that in the vast majority of cases, rape did not occur. That doesn't feel as if it aligns with reality.
Well, I have to say the constitutional position on mine on this, which you've eloquently summarised there, Darren, is the position I adopt, and we must be very careful to make sure that we unless somebody is judged fairly by a jury of their peers to be guilty, they simply are. I should also say this. And it's an unpopular opinion to purvey, but it's one that is rooted in common sense and my experience of these cases. There is such a thing as a false allegation.
Of course,
there is such a thing as an alleged victim who is lying, and there is such a thing as an often naive young man who's found himself in a criminal case who really shouldn't be there.
But we still don't believe, really, do we, that in the vast majority of cases that is what is happening? Because in the vast majority of cases there is no conviction. We simply don't believe that most of the time these accusations are without merit.
Absolutely, but it's important as well when you look at the actual percentages to recognise this is not necessarily cases that have gone to court and resulted in no conviction. Sure. These are the criminal complaints that drop off. And one thing that the report really correctly identifies is that especially with rape victims, especially with somebody who's making a complaint about rape, the sensitivities, the need to treat that person with ultimate professionalism, good communication, precisely the types of things that the police in this period of funding crisis that they're going through over these years are not equipped to do. Unless you do those things, the complainants drop off.
Yeah.
Those victims, those people who have suffered rape, they abandon proceedings, and that is a phenomenon that's identified in the report, because they lose faith in the system, because they're not being treated properly. Those are precisely the types of allegations and precisely the types of numbers that really should play a proper part to trial in these proceedings and aren't.
And that's the point, isn't it? That's where we come in. You come in talking about funding. Increased funding would make the system so much better and more robust for people making the complaints in the first place.
Yeah, and this is a real way, Darren, in which the disingenuous and kind of intellectually intellectually dishonest premise of a libertarian low spend on public services economy and political spending plan has no victims. These are the victims. If you don't fund fundamental public services like the police and the CPS, and of course defence lawyers who need to do this job properly, if you don't do that, then this is the type of thing that happens. And saying somehow that police and the CPS, you can massage their communication processes and this will all be all right. I mean, it flies in the face of what practitioners are seeing on the ground.
Joseph, thank you very much indeed. Joseph Cottrey, Monson Director at Mary Monson Solicitors, who's acted in over 200 rape and sexual abuse cases. So Joseph is pretty clear that the difficulty for, apart from anything else, so many victims and survivors of rape, the difficulties that they've had to face at the early stages of investigations into the crimes against them. Yet another area of the criminal justice system impacted by the cuts made by the Conservative government over the course of the last 10 years.